The wind at 300 feet doesn't just blow, it screams. It claws at your goggles and turns your breath into a mask of ice that reforms every time you exhale, so that by the time you reach the upper array, your face is a sculpture of frozen effort, and your fingers have stopped registering sensation, and the only thing keeping you present, keeping you human, is the taut, mechanical certainty of the rope above your head. Aaron Lewis leans back into his harness. The carabiners click a rhythmic, metallic prayer against the tower's skeleton. Below him, the world is a white abyss. No ground, no horizon, just snow and wind, and the grey suggestion of a mountain that doesn't care whether he makes it back down. He looks at the main load-bearing line. Just above the primary hitch, a single strand of nylon has blossomed outward into a fuzzy white spur. Frayed. He keys his radio. "Base, this is Lewis. Lead line is compromised. Requesting a gear swap before the upper array." Static. Then a voice. Cold, impatient, already reaching for the answer it decided on before the question finished. "Keep moving, Aaron. We're behind schedule." He looks at the rope. He looks at the photo of his 6-year-old daughter taped inside his visor. He begins to climb. He doesn't know what's already been deleted. Aaron Lewis had been climbing professionally for 11 years, and in that time he had developed the particular brand of calm that separates the competent from the reckless. Not fearlessness, which is a liability at altitude, but a disciplined relationship with fear that acknowledged it, catalogued it, and used it like a tool. He was 34 years old, medium build, broad shoulders, hands that were permanently calloused at the palm from years of rope work, and permanently precise when it came to the things that mattered. The inspection of a carabiner gate, the measurement of a splice, the assessment of a line's wear pattern against its load rating. He had been trained by a man named Earl Hutchins, a veteran rigger who had spent 20 years on broadcast towers before retiring to teach, and Earl had one rule that he had repeated so many times it had become structural in Aaron's thinking. The rope doesn't lie. It will always tell you the truth if you're willing to listen. Aaron listened. That was his reputation, and it was the thing his crew respected most about him. His partner on the Mount Talon job was a man named Derek Spaulding. 6 years younger, still building his caution, but sharp and reliable, and the kind of person you wanted on the other end of a radio when the weather turned. They had worked together for 3 years. They communicated in the shorthand of people who have trusted each other in conditions where communication failures are not recoverable. The morning before a climb, Aaron's ritual was the same regardless of the job. He laid his gear out on a clean tarp, never the floor, always a tarp, and went through each item systematically. Harness, helmet, ascenders, belay device, carabiners, each one clipped and unclipped to verify gate spring. Ropes last because ropes deserved the most time, and because Earl had taught him that a rope's story was written across its surface in ways that took patience to read. At home, the ritual had a different shape. He had a daughter named Maya. She was 6, and she had her mother's eyes, and Aaron's habit of asking follow-up questions, which, at 6 years old, meant that a simple bedtime story could expand into a 40-minute philosophical inquiry into why wolves were hungry and whether the moon was cold, and if the man in the tower, she had seen Aaron's job site photos, ever got lonely up there in all that sky. He told her no. He told her the sky was the best office in the world because you could see everything from up there. He told her the harness was like a seatbelt, and the rope was like a guardrail, and the tower was like a very tall building that happened to be outside. She considered this carefully. "But what if the seatbelt breaks?" she asked once. "That's why we check it," Aaron told her. "Every single time. We never skip." He had taped her school photo inside his helmet visor 2 years ago and had never taken it down. She was 4 in the photo, gap-toothed, mid-laugh, wearing a shirt with a cartoon rocket on it. He looked at it at the top of every ascent. Not for sentiment, not as a ritual of superstition, but because it reminded him of what precision was for. Precision wasn't about following rules, it was about coming home. His ex-wife Dana shared custody with a calendar that required coordination and flexibility, and they had worked it into a functional rhythm. Aaron took Maya every weekend he wasn't on a remote job, every school pickup he could manage, every Tuesday dinner without exception. He showed up. He was present. In a life that required him to be physically absent for stretches at a time, he had decided that presence, when possible, was non-negotiable. The Mount Talon contract had come up at the worst possible time, 2 weeks before Maya's birthday, during a window that required the crew to be on site for at least 10 days. He had arranged to have a gift shipped and wrapped, had video called her from base camp on her birthday, with a miniature cake and an off-key version of the song that made her shriek with laughter at his terrible singing. He had promised her he'd be home by the weekend after. He kept every promise he made to Maya. He was still intending to keep that one when the helicopter dropped him and Derek at the base of Mount Talon in a howling February wind. Mount Talon was not a mountain in the romantic sense of the word, not a peak people climbed for the view or posted about for the achievement. It was a communications ridge, a high-elevation spine in the northern range, where Vertex Telecom Services had installed a broadcast array 12 years earlier to serve 3 rural counties whose terrain made ground-based infrastructure impractical. The tower was 280 feet of galvanized steel, anchored into blasted granite, maintained under contract by Summit Line Industrial Climbing Services, which was a subsidiary of a holding company whose office was a floor in a glass building in a city 800 miles away from the mountain. Aaron and Derek worked for Summit Line. Their direct supervisor was a man named Craig Ellison. Ellison was 47, an ex-construction site manager who had moved into industrial climbing oversight after a back injury took him off the rigging floor in his early 30s. He was not technically incompetent. He knew the equipment, understood the work, had spent enough years in the field to speak the language fluently. But he was also, and this mattered enormously, a man whose career advancement had become entangled with the performance metrics of the Summit Line contract with Vertex, which meant that every hour the Talon array was offline was an hour that appeared as a red number on a spreadsheet that Ellison's name was attached to. The array had gone dark on February 8th, a storm-related failure in the upper antenna housing that required manual repair. The weather window to safely access the upper section of the tower was narrow. Meteorological reports gave them roughly 72 hours before the next system moved in, which meant a fast deployment, a focused repair, and an extraction before conditions deteriorated. Aaron had reviewed the job file on the helicopter in. He'd noted the weather projections, noted the timeline, noted the priority designation, which was marked high/contract critical in the system, a designation that Ellison had approved without a supplementary safety hold despite the conditions. Aaron had flagged this in a message to Ellison 2 days before departure, suggesting a 24-hour buffer built into the timeline to allow for gear inspection on-site before ascent. Ellison's response had been prompt and brief. Timeline is set. Vertex is losing $40,000 a day. That's the context. Plan accordingly. Aaron had read the message twice and then forwarded it to Derek without comment. On the ground at Talon, the atmosphere was what experienced climbers called aggressive quiet. The kind of cold that was too complete for ambient noise, the wind moving in gusts that arrived without warning and left the same way, the mountain itself giving nothing away. They set up base operations in a heated equipment shelter at the tower's base and spent the first 2 hours running their standard gear checks, which was protocol and also, for Aaron, instinct. Derek was running the rope inventory when Aaron noticed it. The main load-bearing ascent line, a 12mm dynamic rope that had been pulled from the company's equipment store and logged as inspected, serviceable in the deployment documentation, had a section of visible wear approximately 40 centimeters above the lower primary hitch point. Not catastrophic at first glance. Not the kind of thing that would register immediately to an untrained eye. But Aaron crouched beside it and looked at it the way Earl Hutchins had taught him to look. Slow, systematic, feeling the fibers with his gloved fingertips as well as seeing them. The outer sheath had separated slightly. Beneath it, one of the load-bearing core strands had partially fractured. The kind of internal damage that a rope accumulates over time and cold cycles, and doesn't advertise loudly until it fails entirely. Aaron straightened up. "Derek," he said, "come look at this." Derek came and looked and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Yeah, that's got to be swapped." Aaron reached for his tablet. He opened the digital safety reporting system. He began to type. The Summit Line digital safety reporting system was called SafeTrack, a platform the company had adopted 3 years earlier following an OSHA audit that had flagged their paper-based incident documentation as insufficient for the scope of their operations. The system was, in theory, an improvement. Real-time reporting from field personnel, automatic timestamping, supervisor notification on submission, cloud backup of all entries. In the promotional materials the company had used to roll out the system to its crews, the language was emphatic. Your report is your protection. Submit early, submit accurately. The system works when you work it. Aaron had taken the training seriously. He filed reports consistently and completely, with the detail orientation that characterized everything he did at altitude. His SafeTrack record was, by the time of the Talon deployment, one of the cleanest in the company. Thorough documentation of every flagged piece of equipment, every weather-related hold, every procedural deviation, every near miss that the culture of industrial climbing often encouraged people to absorb quietly and move on from. He sat in the equipment shelter with the tablet on his knee and filed report number SR4471 at 7:52 a.m. on February 11th. He documented the rope's location in the gear inventory, its last inspection date, the specific location and nature of the damage. Outer sheath separation with partial core strand fracture, approximately 40 centimeters above primary hitch, compromises load-bearing integrity under dynamic stress conditions. And his recommendation: equipment to be removed from service, replacement line required before ascent. Estimated delay, 2 to 3 hours pending gear retrieval from base vehicle. He submitted it. The system confirmed receipt with a green check mark and a timestamp. He set the tablet down and began the process of preparing the rest of the gear while the system did what it was supposed to do. Notify the supervisor, log the flag, trigger a response protocol. 22 minutes later, his radio crackled. "Lewis, this is Ellison." The voice had a particular texture to it. Not angry, which would have been straightforward, but managed, which was something more complicated and, Aaron had learned over 2 years of working under Ellison, more dangerous. It was the voice of a man who had already decided the outcome and was now constructing the path to it in real time. "Report received," Ellison said. "I've reviewed the flag." "Good. We'll need the backup 12mm from—" "I've reviewed it," Ellison said again, cutting across him. "And I'm classifying it as a precautionary note, not a stop-work flag. The rope is within operational tolerance for this deployment." Aaron was quiet for a moment. "Craig, I'm looking at the sheath separation. There's a fractured core strand. That's not a precautionary note situation. That's a remove from service situation." "You're a climber, Aaron. I'm the site supervisor. I've assessed the report, and I'm making a judgment call. The judgment call is mine when I'm the one on the line." A pause. When Ellison spoke again, the management had dropped out of his voice, and something flatter had replaced it. "We are 48 hours from weather closure. Vertex is at $40,000 per day offline. I have a contract to maintain, and a crew that I need to trust to operate within reasonable parameters. The rope has been assessed. It is serviceable for this climb. If you're not comfortable with that assessment..." Another pause, deliberate, allowing the weight of the next words to land clearly. "I can have Mercer up there in 2 hours, and I'll note in the project file that Lewis declined the assignment." Aaron looked at Derek, who was watching him from across the shelter, with the careful stillness of a man who knows that the answer given in the next 10 seconds will have a long echo. To be marked as having declined an assignment on a contract-critical job was not a firing. Not formally, but in the calculus of a company like Summit Line, it was the beginning of an exit. Fewer deployments, lower priority assignments, gradual marginalization until the relationship simply dissolved. Aaron thought about the backup line in the base vehicle. He thought about the fractured core strand. He thought about Maya's rocket shirt. "I'll make the climb," he said. He didn't know, couldn't have known, that even as he spoke, Ellison was opening SafeTrack on a desktop terminal in the warm office 800 miles away, finding report number SR4471 and moving his cursor to the administrative delete function that site supervisors had access to for the purpose of removing duplicate or erroneous entries. The cursor hovered. Ellison clicked. The green checkmark disappeared. There is a specific psychology to being talked out of your own perception. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with obvious coercion or dramatic confrontation. It comes in through the side door, wearing the language of reason and experience and team responsibility, and it works on the part of you that has been trained since childhood to defer to authority, to trust the chain of command, to believe that the people above you in the hierarchy have access to information and context that you don't, and that their judgment, therefore, has dimensions yours might lack. Craig Ellison was not an unusual man. He was, in many ways, a completely ordinary product of a corporate culture that had learned to speak the language of safety while optimizing for cost. He ran his crew with competence and genuine operational knowledge. He had never, in his 11 years with Summit Line, ordered a climber into a situation he personally believed was going to kill them. He had, instead, developed a graduated system of internal justification, a series of small reclassifications, each individually defensible, that allowed him to move the threshold of acceptable risk just far enough to meet the deadline, just far enough to protect the contract, just far enough that no single decision looked, in isolation, like negligence. The rope had passed its last formal inspection. Weir was within documented parameters for high-altitude cold-weather deployment. Fractures in outer sheath material were common and not automatically disqualifying. Aaron Lewis was an experienced climber who was, perhaps, reading a level of risk into the damage that wasn't objectively supported by the equipment's maintenance record. This was the story Ellison told himself, and in the shelter, with the radio in his hand, Aaron was working against that story and finding it slippery. The way arguments from authority are always slippery when the authority sounds certain, and you are cold and behind schedule and aware that a man named Mercer is a phone call away. Derek had pulled him aside after the radio call, in the 10 minutes between Ellison's ultimatum and the beginning of prep. "You don't have to do this," Derek said. His voice was low and even, and carried the particular weight of a man who means what he says and doesn't embellish. "I know. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you the option exists." "And then what?" Aaron said. "They send Mercer up on the same rope." Derek had no answer for that, because it was true, and both of them knew it, and the truth of it was one of the mechanisms by which the culture sustained itself. The knowledge that refusing didn't eliminate the risk, it only transferred it to someone else, and that transfer came with its own weight. Aaron checked his harness. He checked the ascenders. He ran his hand one more time along the rope and stopped at the damaged section, and held it there for a moment, fingers reading the surface the way Earl had taught him. Not looking for something different from what he'd already found, but paying his respects to it, acknowledging what the rope was telling him. "I am compromised. I am telling you. Are you listening?" "I'm listening," he said quietly, to no one, to the rope, to Earl, who was retired in Arizona, to his own 11 years of training. Then he hooked the ascender and began. The tower rose above him in the grey morning light, 280 feet of steel lattice disappearing into low cloud, the upper array invisible from the ground, the wind already building in the gusts that meant the system was moving faster than the meteorological window had predicted. At the 80-foot mark, he checked the rope again. At 140 feet, he checked it again. At 220 feet, with the ground gone and the sky beginning, and the wind at the pitch that stops feeling like weather and starts feeling like intention, he felt the rope shiver. Just once, just enough. He looked up. There is no music. That's the thing that survivors of catastrophic falls describe later, when they can describe anything at all. The complete absence of the emotional soundtrack that narrative has trained us to expect in moments of crisis. No swelling strings, no dramatic percussion, just the pure, physical, indifferent language of force and mass and the acceleration that the earth applies to everything, without exception, without mercy, without interest in the story attached to the falling body. At 11:34 a.m. on February 11th, at approximately 260 feet above the base of Mount Talon Tower, the main load-bearing ascent line failed. The fracture propagated from the compromised core strand outward in a split second that Aaron's helmet camera, a 4K unit mounted on a forward bracket above the visor, captured at 60 frames per second. The footage would later be reviewed by materials engineers, safety investigators, and a federal court, and their shared assessment would be consistent. The failure was catastrophic and sudden, initiating at the pre-existing damage point identified in report number SR4471 and completing in under 40 milliseconds under the dynamic load of a 185-pound climber in high wind conditions. The world in Aaron's visor went sideways. There was a sound, not the dramatic crack that people imagine when they think of a rope breaking, but something shorter and denser, a syllable of mechanical failure that registered more in the chest than the ears. Then the sensation of the harness taking full load, the secondary belay system catching, which was why Aaron was alive, which was the redundancy that the safety protocol required, and that the primary line's failure had now rendered critical. But the secondary system had been sized and rated for a controlled backup scenario, not for the full dynamic shock load of a 260-foot free pendulum swing in 40 miles per hour gusts. The belay device held. The anchor point at his waist held, but the force of the arrest, the abrupt translation of downward velocity into lateral swing, was sufficient to produce what the medical reports would later describe as a T4 compression fracture of the thoracic spine, bilateral rib fractures at 4 points, a shattered right wrist from impact with the tower lattice, and a traumatic brain injury classified as moderate to severe. Derek, monitoring from a lower anchor point at 180 feet, saw the rope go. He moved immediately, the trained, automatic response of a man who has rehearsed the emergency protocol enough times that muscle memory operates faster than conscious decision. He deployed his own anchor, established a secondary line, and began descending toward Aaron's position while simultaneously keying his radio with a transmission that base camp would later describe as the most controlled distress call they had ever received. Clear coordinates, clear injury description, clear request for emergency extraction, all delivered in a voice that was shaking but functional. It took 47 minutes for the helicopter to reach them. In those 47 minutes, Derek held Aaron against the tower face, one hand on the harness, one hand on the radio, talking to him steadily and without stopping in the way that people talk to someone they're afraid of losing. Not because they believe the words will fix anything, but because the sound of a human voice in a blizzard at 260 feet is the only thing available that resembles warmth. Aaron was conscious intermittently. He said two things in those 47 minutes that Derek would later testify to under oath. The first was his daughter's name. The second was a question. Did they swap the rope? Derek told him the medics were coming. Aaron didn't ask again. The helicopter arrived in a wind that made the extraction a 40-minute operation, requiring 3 attempts. By the time they got him strapped and lifted, the storm the meteorological window had promised was another 24 hours away, had arrived early and complete, closing the mountain behind them like a door. The Summit Line press statement was released at 6:14 p.m. on the day of the accident, before Aaron had been out of surgery long enough to be told his own prognosis. It was 3 paragraphs. The language was careful in the specific way corporate communications become careful when lawyers have reviewed every word before publication. Not technically false in any individual sentence, but arranged to produce a conclusion that the facts, properly examined, did not support. The statement expressed concern for Aaron's well-being and the well-being of his family. It noted that an internal review had been initiated. It described the incident, in the 3rd paragraph, as resulting from conditions consistent with equipment stress in an extreme weather deployment, and noted that preliminary assessment suggests the incident may have involved improper anchoring technique, inconsistent with Summit Line's established safety protocols. Improper anchoring technique. Those 3 words were the architecture of a defense that the company had begun constructing before Aaron came off the mountain. In the days that followed, the internal review produced documentation that, on its surface, appeared thorough. Equipment logs showing the rope's last formal inspection dated 31 days before the deployment. Weather assessment records confirming the deployment window had been approved at the supervisory level. Training records for Aaron Lewis, which were impeccable, and which the review noted, without apparent irony, as evidence that he had been equipped with the knowledge to perform the anchoring procedure correctly. The implication being that a deviation from proper technique was therefore a personal failure, not a systemic one. What the internal review did not produce was report number SR4471. Because report number SR4471 no longer existed in the system. Ellison had been interviewed by the internal review team on the 2nd day. He was composed. He had legal representation present, which was company-provided and attentive. He confirmed the timeline of the deployment, confirmed that Aaron had raised a concern over the radio that morning, and characterized it as a verbal flag that he had assessed in real time and determined did not rise to stop work level. A judgment call within his supervisory authority, made in good faith based on available information. He noted that Aaron had agreed to proceed. He did not mention SafeTrack. No one in the internal review asked about SafeTrack because the internal review was conducted by Summit Line's own risk management department, which reported to the same division that managed the Vertex contract, which Ellison's performance was tied to, which was the circle that had been drawing itself tighter since the morning of February 11th. Aaron's family, Dana, his ex-wife, who had driven through the night with Maya in the back seat to reach the hospital, received the company's communication through a liaison whose job appeared to be delivering information in ways that reduced rather than created legal exposure. Dana was told the company's thoughts were with them. She was given a packet of information about Summit Line's employee support services. She was told the investigation was ongoing and that she would be kept informed. She was not told about the deletion. She hired a lawyer named Priya Mehta 3 days after Aaron came out of his medically induced coma, when the doctors confirmed the spinal injury was permanent and the prognosis for full recovery was, as the neurologist put it, with the careful precision of a person who takes honesty seriously, unlikely. Aaron would walk again, with work and time and a level of physical therapy that would require years. He would never climb again. Mehta filed a preservation of evidence demand immediately. She was thorough and experienced, and had handled industrial injury litigation for 14 years, and the speed of the company's human error narrative the way it had materialized fully formed within hours of the accident, had the particular smell, she told her associate in a private call, of something pre-prepared. She was right. She just didn't know yet what had been pre-deleted. Marcus Webb had worked in IT infrastructure for Summit Line for 6 years and had the specific, largely invisible professional profile of someone who is very good at a job that no one thinks about until it breaks. He managed server maintenance, backup protocols, and system integrity monitoring for the company's operational software portfolio, which included SafeTrack. He was 31, methodical, and possessed of a professional attachment to clean data that was almost aesthetic in nature. He found poorly managed server logs genuinely distressing, in the way some people find a crooked picture on a wall distressing, and he had spent years building Summit Line's backup architecture to be clean, redundant, and reliable. On February 18th, 1 week after the accident, 4 days after Priya Mehta's preservation demand landed on Summit Line's legal department, Marcus ran a routine integrity audit of the SafeTrack database as part of a scheduled maintenance cycle. The audit was automated, generating a comparison log of all database entries against the backup shadow copy maintained on a secondary server. A redundancy Marcus had implemented personally 2 years earlier, specific because the primary SafeTrack server had experienced 2 data corruption events in the previous 18 months, and he did not trust a single copy system for safety-critical records. The comparison flagged a discrepancy. A record identified in the backup shadow copy as SR4471 did not have a corresponding entry in the primary database. The primary database showed a deletion event for that record, ID, at 8:31 a.m. on February 11th, logged under Ellison's administrator credentials, classified in the system as erroneous entry removal. Marcus looked at this for a long time. He pulled the backup copy of SR4471 and read it. He cross-referenced the timestamp of the deletion, 8:31 a.m., against the timeline of the accident. The deletion had occurred 43 minutes before Aaron Lewis fell. Marcus sat at his workstation and understood, completely and immediately, what he was looking at. He was looking at the reason a preservation demand had arrived on the legal department's desk 6 days ago. He was looking at evidence of a supervisor using administrative access to remove a safety flag from the record before an accident that the company was now characterizing as the climber's fault. He was also looking at the moment in which his own professional life was going to become significantly more complicated, and he knew it, and he sat with the knowledge of it for approximately 20 minutes before he made a decision. The decision was not heroic in any dramatic sense. Marcus Webb was not a crusader. He did not have a personal connection to Aaron Lewis. What he had was a profound, almost constitutional commitment to the integrity of the systems he maintained, and the deletion of SR4471 was a violation of that integrity so complete and so deliberate that he found himself incapable of treating it as anything other than what it was. He made a complete forensic copy of the discrepancy evidence, the backup record, the primary database deletion log, the access credentials, the timestamp chain, and stored it on an encrypted personal drive. Then he called his personal lawyer. His personal lawyer called Priya Mehta the following morning. The call lasted 20 minutes. Afterward, Mehta sat at her desk and was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when something shifted the center of gravity of a case. Then she picked up her pen and started writing. The forensic copy was preserved and authenticated through a process that involved a third-party digital forensics firm and a chain of custody protocol that by the time it was complete was as airtight as Marcus's server backups. The data told a story that had only one coherent interpretation. On the morning of February 11th, at 8:31 a.m., Craig Ellison had used his administrative access to Summit Line's safety reporting system to delete a filed report documenting a compromised rope, a report submitted by the man who would fall from that rope 43 minutes later. The ghost in the machine had a name, and now it had a witness. The trial of Lewis versus Summit Line Industrial Climbing Services et al. Opened in September of the following year, in a federal courtroom that was full from the first day, in the way that cases are full when the public has already arrived at a verdict and is waiting for the institution to catch up. Priya Mehta's co-counsel was a litigator named Thomas Brandt, who specialized in corporate liability and had a reputation for the particular talent of making complex technical evidence legible to a jury, of taking data and systems and deleted files and translating them into the human terms of what they meant, what they caused, and who decided. The defense, managed by Summit Line's retained firm, entered the trial on the foundation of the improper anchoring narrative, which had been reinforced and documented over 14 months of pre-trial maneuvering. Their position was consistent. Aaron Lewis was a trained professional who had made a procedural error in adverse conditions. The company had acted appropriately within its operational parameters. The loss was tragic. It was not corporate negligence. The defense held this position until the fourth day. On the fourth day, Thomas Brandt requested that the courtroom's display screen be activated. He walked the jury through the architecture of SafeTrack in language that required no technical background to follow. A system designed to protect workers by ensuring safety flags were permanently recorded, reviewed, and acted upon. A system built on the premise that a climber's documented concern was not a suggestion but a formal record, one that the company was legally and ethically obligated to retain and respond to. He showed them report number SR4471 as it existed in the backup shadow copy. Aaron's precise, detailed documentation of the fractured rope, time-stamped at 7:52 a.m. on February 11th. Then he showed them the deletion event, time-stamped at 8:31 a.m., executed under Ellison's credentials, classified as erroneous entry removal. Then he showed them the accident report timestamp, 11:34 a.m. The courtroom was very quiet. Marcus Webb testified for 2 hours. He was methodical, calm, and spoke with the authority of a man whose relationship to data was so precise that opposing counsel's attempts to complicate his testimony kept meeting the same wall. The numbers did not change, the timestamps did not change, the access logs did not change. He had not searched for something incriminating. He had found an anomaly while doing his job and followed it to its source, and the source was what it was. Ellison testified on the 6th day. His composure, which had held through 14 months of deposition, was visibly different in the courtroom. A controlled and careful performance that the jury watched with the attention of people who have already seen the deleted file and are now watching the man who deleted it explain himself. He maintained that the deletion had been an administrative correction, that the verbal flag had been assessed appropriately, that his judgment had been sound. Thomas Brandt's cross-examination lasted 4 hours. When it was over, the improper anchoring narrative had been taken apart piece by piece and laid out on the courtroom floor, and what remained visible in its absence was the plain architecture of what had happened. A man had documented a danger. A supervisor had erased the documentation. The danger had materialized exactly as the man had described, and the company had then used the absence of the documentation to blame the man they had failed. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. The verdict was returned on a Thursday morning. Compensatory damages for Aaron's medical care, lost earnings, and permanent disability. Punitive damages directed at Summit Line and its parent company for what the jury instructions described as willful and deliberate suppression of evidence in a workplace safety context. Total, $18 million. The courtroom did not erupt, it settled. The particular settling of people who have been holding a weight for a long time and are only now allowed to set it down. Aaron, seated in a wheelchair in the gallery, with Dana beside him and Priya Mehta's hand briefly on his shoulder, looked at the number on the display screen and said nothing. The coverage ran everywhere for a week. $18 million Verdict: rocks climbing contractor. Deleted safety report at center of historic ruling. Lewis law proposed following tower climber settlement. The number was the headline because numbers are how institutions communicate significance. But in the private geography of Aaron Lewis's daily life, the $18 million landed with a particular hollowness that he had difficulty explaining to people who hadn't been through something like it. They expected relief. They expected vindication. They expected the satisfaction of a truth proven in the most formal arena available. What Aaron felt, in the days after the verdict, was primarily tired. He was 37 years old. He had spent the better part of 4 years in depositions, medical facilities, physical therapy rooms, and legal consultations. He had rebuilt his ability to walk, slowly, painfully, with a physical therapist named Jolene, who had no interest in his excuses and an absolute commitment to his recovery, to the point where he could manage a slow mile on level ground with a cane. His right hand had healed to about 70% functionality. The spinal compression meant that his back, on bad days, communicated its damage in ways that made sustained activity difficult and certain positions impossible. He would not climb again. He had accepted this in the unspectacular way that people accept irrevocable losses, not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, in the accumulated weight of ordinary days that no longer contained the thing that had given them a particular shape. He had moved into a house 3 blocks from Dana's, which had been the priority use of the first settlement advance. Proximity to Maya, who was 10 now and had her mother's eyes and Aaron's habit of listening carefully before responding, and a new interest in engineering that she had announced one afternoon by taking apart a kitchen appliance to see how it worked. Aaron had helped her put it back together. They had spent 4 hours on it. He had not been able to kneel on the floor with her the way he once would have, but he had sat beside her at the kitchen table and walked her through the process piece by piece, and the appliance had worked when they finished, and Maya had looked at the assembled mechanism with the satisfaction of a person who understands something they didn't understand before. That afternoon was the closest Aaron had come, in 4 years, to something that felt like himself. The settlement paid medical debts that had accumulated to a number that appeared in his financial documents like a geological feature. Massive, unavoidable, the result of years of specialized care. It funded the physical therapy that continued. It established a trust for Maya's education, which had been the first legal document Aaron had requested pre-draft once the settlement terms were confirmed. Before the house, before the debt payments, the trust. Craig Ellison had resigned from Summit Line 18 months before the verdict, during the period when the pre-trial discovery had made the shape of the case clear to everyone involved. He was not criminally charged, which was a fact that Aaron had made his peace with in the approximate way one makes peace with things that aren't changeable. Not acceptance exactly, but a decision not to let the unresolved peace consume the space needed for the things that were resolved. The subsidiary that had held the Summit Line contract was dissolved in the aftermath of the verdict. The parent company restructured its safety compliance protocols under regulatory pressure. New language was added to their operational guidelines. The SafeTrack administrative deletion function was removed and replaced with an immutable record system that logged changes without permitting removal. Aaron was told about the system change in an email. He read it and closed it, and went to pick up Maya from school, which was what he did on Tuesdays without exception. The number on the verdict was $18 million. The price of what was lost did not fit in a number. It never does. Mount Talon stands in February light, same as always. A new crew works the tower base in brand new gear. Double redundant lines, immutable reporting, no deletions permitted. At the tower's base, a small brass plaque has been bolted into the granite. It reads, Aaron Lewis. He checked the rope. He told the truth. Check yours. Some lessons are written in blood. This one is.